Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over some opening theory, specifically looking at a fun opening, the Steinitz game, and it derives from the Vienna game, which is pawn e4, pawn e5, knight to c3, trying to control the center of the board, and then knight coming to c6. Now from here, white has a lot of different options. There's another video on the Vienna game, but in this variation, the Steinitz Gambit, white offers up a pawn here on f4. In this video, we're going to be looking at what happens after black takes here on f4. Now, anytime you give up material, anytime you're giving a gambit to your opponent, you want to get something back in return. Could be a lead in development, could be an extra tempo that you need to gain an advantage. In the Steinitz Gambit, white really wants to dominate the center of the board, and so they're going to play pawn to d4, and it's going to be a central theme. It doesn't matter if they have to get their king involved into the board, kind of make everything look a little messy. All they really want to do is dominate the center of the board. Now black has a lot of different variations. We're going to spend a lot of time on the main variation, which is queen coming down to h4, forcing the king to come here to e2. But black, if they haven't seen the Steinitz Gambit, may decide to do a few other variations besides queen to h4. So I do want to cover those briefly before we get into the main line. One variation you may see, or again, it really depends on how much your opponent has played against the Steinitz Gambit, how familiar with they are. They could always play knight to f6. This would be a terrible move. All white has to do is just play pawn to e5, continue to put pressure. There's no real good square for this black knight to go. He can't go to d5 or e4. He's going to be captured by the white knight. He can't go here to g4 or h5. He's going to be captured by the queen. He just is going to have to come back here to g8. He's going to lose a lot of time and tempo moving back. White can now just recapture with his bishop here on f4. White's completely dominated the center of the board, and he's gained back that material that he lost from the gambit early on. So that would be a bad move. Another move that black may try is bishop coming down to b4, pinning this knight down on c3. From here, white can just continue and retake the material back on f4. White's not too worried about if this knight is taken. Doubled pawns on the c file right away is not going to be the worst thing. So this is going to, again, still be a decent game for white. Another move you may see is just pawn to d6, getting ready to get this light square bishop involved into the game. This is going to be one of the worst moves that black can make. Again, there's a lot of bad moves they can make if they're not too familiar with this. Because again, from here, all white has to do is just retake this material back on f4. He is completely dominating the center of the board, and he's no longer down material. So black needs to hold on to that material. He has a lot of different options, but because he accepted that gambit, he needs to find a weakness in white and expose that. Instead of playing real careful and giving that material right back to white and letting white dominate the center of the board, which is really all white cares about. Now the move you will see more often than not is the queen coming down to h4. Even if black is not too familiar with the Steinitz Gambit, if they just kind of look at it, if they've ever played the King's Gambit, this is a pretty common move. Getting the queen involved into the game, attacking this king knowing that the pawn can't come here to g3 and block it. Black, if they look at this, makes it kind of seem like white made a mistake here. Why would they allow their king to come here to e2? White can no longer castle. Kind of seems like he's in a lot of danger here. Why would white do this? And the reason is, white is completely fine with his king on e2. He doesn't even want to castle on one side or the other. Instead, he wants to get his king involved into the game, and he wants to use that as a defender and an attacker in the late game, dominating the center of the board. If he has to trade off queens, his king's no longer in a big threat. But it's really going to be difficult for black to put a lot of pressure on this king here on e2. He does have the queen on h4, but as we'll see going over a lot of different variations, white can easily get his pieces developed into the game, putting pressure back on black and forcing black to make a lot of hard decisions as far as how he's actually going to attack this white king here on e2. Now from here, black has a lot of different options. We're going to be going over a lot of them in this video. The best move from black is kind of a hard move to find if you're not too familiar with the Steinitz Gambit, but it's playing pawn to b6. Now why does he want to do this? Again, black wants to continue to put pressure on white's king. White wants to control the center of the board. But again, black wants to get his pieces developed in the board. He realizes that just one queen is not going to do a whole heck of a lot. So he plays pawn to b6 so that he can get his bishop involved into the game here to e6. Again, attacking the king here on e2. Now, white really needs to figure out where he's going to place his king. Can't really place it on e3, can't really place it on f2 or e1. If he brings it to f3, that's really exposing it a lot more than he really wants to. So white from here is just going to play queen to d2 so that when the bishop comes down to a6, he has a nice little hideout for his king here on d1. Now black has a lot of different options. You could always see something like the bishop coming down to f1. The light square bishop typically for black is not really used, where the light square bishop for white is really strong early on to the game. So black may decide to go ahead and exchange those. From here, white's going to take the opportunity, go ahead and snag the square on f3. This does a couple things. It protects this pawn here on h2, which will be important later on, but it also attacks this queen here on h4, forcing him to move. So if he comes back, we can put him on h5, pinning down this knight so he's not going to move. Now the rook can come over here to f1. Now if we kind of look at it, black really still doesn't have a huge attack. All of his pieces are really tied down. Can't really do a whole heck of a lot. Can't attack this pawn here on h2. Can't attack this pawn here on d4. The king is, pretty safe right now. He can play a move, pawn to b3, get his dark square bishop involved into the game. White can always play queen takes here on f4. He can bring his knight here to d5, attacking this square on c7, forking the rook on a8. So white has a lot of different moves, and again, black is going to have a hard time really attacking the white king. So again, that's if black plays the best move, which is pawn to b6, but there's a lot of different other variations that you may see instead of pawn to b6. One of them is just to continue to attack with the king. Again, a lot of players that are playing black against the Steinitz Gambit look at this and they say, okay, the king's exposed, he's on e2. I feel like in chess I should just be able to chase him around until he does something wrong. So we'll kind of look at what that looks like. They could always play queen to g4. From here, white can just play knight to f3, and this is going to be a move that you see all throughout the variations. Is this just nice defensive move, knight to f3, developing a piece, controlling the center of the board, and later on going to be a nuisance for this queen as he can kind of chase them all around. Now from here, again, black still has options. If he now decides to go ahead and, let's say, play pawn to b6, which we just looked at, now it's going to be a little bit too late. White now has a huge momentum, and he can just play pawn to h3. Again, if we look at this, white really has to move and do something. Let's say he tries to play queen to h5, again, still pinning down this knight to the king. White can just play the nice little move, knight to d5, and what this does is it really puts a lot of pressure on the square to c7. The rook can come here to b8, the knight can take here on c7. He can decide to go ahead and bring his bishop here to f4, completely dominating the center of the board, and white is still putting pressure. He can now bring his knight here to c7, or even if the king comes over, same thing, the knight can now take here on f4, attacking the queen, or white can just decide to even put more pressure, bringing his bishop here to f4, and again putting more pressure on this pawn on c7. So, from there, or instead of coming back here, let's say to h5, the queen could come to g3, decide, hey, I'm just going to continue putting pressure on this side. Now the white queen can just come to e1. Again, white doesn't really care if he trades off queens. He hasn't castled his king, so he wants to keep his king in the center of the board and get to the endgame if possible. And he knows that if there's an exchange of queens, his king is going to be a lot safer going forward. So white really doesn't matter right here if black decides to trade off, because after the trade right here, white's completely dominating the center of the board. He can bring, bishop to f4 next. He can get his light square bishop involved into the game, and he can just start forcing his king up the board. So definitely going to be a, really good game from white here. Now, instead of, let's say pawn to b6, another move you may see is, knight to f6. Now from here, we've already talked about in another variation. But typically when you see this knight to f6, white's just going to push forward. Again, he wants to control the center of the board, and this knight here on f6 is putting a damper in that. So white wants to attack that. Now, black from here, if he wants, he could play knight to h5. White can go ahead and get his knight developed to b5, as we talked about, putting a lot of pressure on this pawn on c7. There's no real clear path for how black's really going to attack this king here on e2. He's somewhat safe here, and white's putting a lot of pressure on the queen side for black. So this is going to be a good game for white. Another variation you may see is the pawn coming to c6, d6, opening up the door for his white square bishop to get involved into the game. From here, white's just going to play knight to f3. Again, you're going to play this move over and over again if you play the Steinitz Gambit from white. Attacking this queen, black can either move his queen if he wanted to, or you may see black coming down, developing his bishop, pinning down this knight here to f3. From here, white can just take here on f4. Again, he wants to take this sooner than later. Now, if white wanted to, he could start to put more pressure on black, but he's dominating the center of the board right here. And again, this knight is pretty much locking down any strong attack that black really has on white. So if we come back, instead of d6, one very popular move is the counter gambit. And that is, again, if you think about what white wants to do, it wants to dominate the center of the board. So one thing that black can always try to do is counterattack and say, okay, I'm going to give up that material back here on d5. Now from here, the best play from white, the easiest play from white, is just to go ahead and take this material back. Now, white gave up material on f4. Black's going to give up material here on d5. Now there's two variations. Both kind of tend to lead to the same result, and they kind of look like this. Now that pawn has come to d5, now this e file is completely open. Both kings are completely exposed. White is losing control of the center. It's now kind of a free-for-all. Black can go ahead and get more pieces developed into the game. He could bring his bishop down here to g4. Again, the knight's going to come to f3, blocking the attack and also attacking the queen here on h4. Now the knight can come here to b4, getting involved into the action. The knight can't move because he is still pinned down. White can just play, pawn to a3, attacking this knight. If the bishop decides to go ahead and take here on f3, that's not a problem. Pawn can come here to f3. Black now, if he wants to, it would kind of be a mistake for him to move his knight right away. As you can tell, he can't take this pawn here on d5, which he would like to, because the knight on c3 is protecting it. But what he could do, as we'll look at, he could always bring his queen back to e7, put more pressure. If the king comes back to f2, again, there's not a lot of safe places, but now when the queen comes to h4, let's say the king comes back to g1 after now he's on g5, the bishop can block this off, but now this pawn is protected by both this queen and this knight. So now the knight can safely come here to d5. But if we look at it again, black still doesn't have a huge attack that he can have on white. And if we look at it, white can still do some stuff. He definitely has a tough road ahead of him as far as launching an attack. But he can definitely eventually get his dark square bishop involved into the game. He can always check the king if he wanted to. So this is just going to be a chaotic game, which typically you get from a counter gambit. Now the move order could change a little bit. Obviously we looked at what happens if the bishop comes down first. But instead you may just see the knight come down to b4 right away. From here it could play pawn to a3. But then the bishop can just come immediately down to g4. We could see the same thing. The knight's going to come to f3. And then this is kind of the situation we had before. Another variation you may see is the dark square bishop getting involved into the game, pinning down this knight. Unfortunately for black, the knight is no longer pinned to anything. So the knight can actually just come, again being aggressive, and just play knight here to d5, attacking not only this bishop here on b4, but also attacking the pawn here on c7. This is going to be completely fine if black decides to move somewhere. White can go ahead and come, get involved into the game, take here on f4. So he has a lot of good moves. Black, if you wanted to, could block himself off here on d6. You typically don't want to block off your d pawn. That's typically where you're going to get that involved into the game, try to counterattack the mid, and then get your light square bishop involved into the game. So again, this little subtle move, even though it seems pretty logical for Black to place his bishop here on b4, it does put a lot of pressure on Black once White just plays knight here to d5. Now another move you may see is, before we talked about the queen coming here to g4 attacking, he could always come back here to h5. Again, it's a little more passive, but it's still attacking the queen, the king here on e2. And he may do this for a various reasons, but now when the knight comes here to f3, instead of having to worry a whole lot about the queen, Black can just play pawn down to g5, which is an interesting move, trying to, forget about his own king safety as far as castling on the king side and then making something happen. Instead, he says, you know what, I'm just going to push forward, typically like you would against a king's gambit. Start to push forward and try to see if I can kick this knight off here of f3. From here, again, White's going to now play knight to d5. And this is a huge move why the Vienna game is so good for White, is because the knight's here on c3, where in a lot of other variations like the king's gambit, it may not be. So again, this is putting pressure not only on this f4 square, but also on this c7 square, which is, in this specific spot, a huge weakness for Black. From here, let's say the pawn comes down to g4. This is actually going to be a pretty big mistake from Black. White just gets a huge advantage. After the exchange, the king's going to have to move. After the exchange here on a8, even after the pawn takes and the pawn retakes for White, again, there's no clear path for Black to do anything, and White's up more material. It's definitely going to be a better game for White. So hopefully you guys enjoy this video talking about the Steinitz Gambit. It's an interesting move because your opponent typically looks at you like you're crazy. Why is your king there on e2? He's not doing a whole heck of a lot. And then they actually try to formulate a plan to attack your king, and they realize, wow, that's going to be a lot tougher than I thought. In the meantime, you're trying to just completely destroy the center of the board, which a lot of times is very easy to do. So hopefully you guys enjoy the opening theory. If you want to learn more opening theory, if you wonder which opening is right for your style of play, it could be the Steinitz Gambit, it could be something else. But if you're curious, if you want a full meal deal of chess, I do have a 10 DVD set collection called All Things Chess now, and it's on sale right now at chesscentral.com. Make sure you check it out, and I'll see you guys in other videos. Thanks for watching.